Hey everyone, for this lab I'm going to show you how to ferment cabbage to make sauerkraut. And so I've already cut the cabbage up, but I'm going to give you a little tips for the whole head of cabbage since that's what you're going to buy at the store. So when you have your cabbage, the first thing I do is I peel off the very top layers of the cabbage. And so here are some of the top layers that I kept. And obviously you can see this isn't what we want to use. It doesn't look good, so it's not going to make very good sauerkraut in the end. We want more of this part of it, this nice purple, nice reddish mixture of color where it looks fresh. Now, I'm using red cabbage. Typically, sauerkraut is made with green cabbage, but I prefer red cabbage because it has a little sweeter taste than the green cabbage. However, green cabbage is still good. Now, once you cut your cabbage in half, okay, you're going to see a middle pit stem area. This part, it's going to be a little bit bigger because this is only half of it. You're going to want to cut that out. And so what I do is I take my knife and very carefully I cut a triangle towards the middle. Once you cut a triangle, it should be easy to kind of just pull this stem part out. And so obviously it's going to be a little bit bigger with a whole head of cabbage, but definitely remove this nasty white stem part. Once you have your cabbage, I start from the stem end and I'm going to cut away from myself strips of the cabbage. Okay, and so after I'm done cutting, that was a little bit big, that's okay. After I'm done cutting, I'll actually cut it in half again, just so it's not super long when I'm trying to pack it into the jar. And then I'm gonna put it into a bowl. I'm gonna kind of squeeze just to separate some of the cabbage from itself. And then eventually, once I cut up my entire cabbage, put it into the bowl, I'm going to use salt to go through a process called sweating the cabbage. So go ahead and add your salt into your cabbage and then just start turning it. And as you turn this for about 10 or so minutes, you're gonna start to see the cabbage actually release some of the water content from it. And that's what we want, because we want all of that water content to eventually become our salt brine that's gonna help in the fermentation process. So I'll show you this after about 10 minutes and we will pack our cabbage into the jars. Okay, so I've been turning the cabbage for about 5-10 minutes now. And then if I don't feel like it is releasing enough water, I just start to add a little bit of salt at a time until you kind of get this nice glistening on the cabbage. With green cabbage, it's gonna sweat a little bit more than red cabbage. So at this point, I'm ready to start packing my jar to make sauerkraut. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually showing you what my grandmother taught me with making sauerkraut. And so she takes a couple of handfuls at a time and then starts packing down the cabbage into the jar. And she will actually use a baseball bat because she will make her cabbage sauerkraut in a crock. And so if you have grandparents that have old crocks, I'm sure they don't want you using it for this, but I'm sure they can tell you some good stories about them maybe making sauerkraut. And so we're just going to go ahead and continue to press on the cabbage in the jar. And after a while, I'm going to add a little bit more. And the purpose of this is to get the salt brine that we've created, because it's pulling out the water, to go above the cabbage. And what my grandmother taught me is fill up the jar about 3/4 of the way. That way you have a little bit of leeway with your brine and the weight that you're gonna put into your jar. Okay, so I'm gonna continue to add this and I'm gonna continue to press down on the cabbage until I have about 1/2 inch to 1 inch of water above my cabbage.
So what should someone use if they don't have this tool?
So if you don't have anything that kind of fits into a pint or a quart jar, I'm using a wide mouth jar, by the way. You don't want to use regular mouth because the mouth is too small. So use a wide mouth jar. If you don't have a tool like this, You can either use your fingers if you're able to reach down into the jar far enough, or you can use any type of silverware. Just make sure that it isn't a good piece of silverware because you might bend it a little bit by pressure pushing down on the cabbage. But if you, again, can reach it, you just push down along the edge, then sometimes in the middle, and continue that process until that brine starts to fill up the jar. Put about a handful at a time into the jar, and then I will go through about a couple of minutes process of pushing down on that cabbage. Now that I've got closer to the top of my jar, or 3/4 of the way up, I'm gonna go ahead and stop there because I want a little bit of leadway with this brine that's in the jar. So you can see after I've pushed down on the cabbage, there's a good amount of salt water basically now, which we call brine, that's going to be sitting above the cabbage. But you can see that there's still some floating at the top. So this is what we're going to do to prevent that. And this is a trick from my grandmother as well.
Why is it important that no cabbage is floating?
It's important that we get the cabbage below the brine so that it doesn't mold. Because if it's exposed to oxygen, then that's the recipe for mold to take over. And if you have mold, you have to throw out the entire thing, because if you see mold, the entire thing is moldy. Same thing with bread. If you see the mold already, the entire loaf of bread is already done. So this is a trick from my grandmother. We saved the top leaves for a reason, because we are actually going to use that as a barrier for our sauerkraut, for our cabbage now, sauerkraut in a couple of weeks. Okay, so I take a leaf, and I am actually, and this is why you need to do it maybe over a towel because it will spill a little bit. I'm going to push the leaf down so that it is covering the cabbage. And then after it's covering the cabbage, I'm going to take a glass weight, which you can buy these on Amazon. They're specifically for fermentation. Or what I've used in the past when I don't have a glass weight, I've taken a couple of bags and I either make a saline solution, so a little bit of salt with water. That way if it does break open, it's not going to hurt anything because this is saltwater brine. Or if you're very careful, I've actually used a bag and put some rocks in there, and the rocks are used to push down the cabbage. Okay, so I will put the weight in there. And if you have too much cabbage, like say right now, it is okay to remove some of that cabbage to use in your next jar. Or, since I do have this weight and it covers a large portion of the jar, I don't necessarily need this. This is kind of just an old school trick my grandmother taught me if you don't have something to keep pushing down on the cabbage to keep it below the brine. Okay, so I'm just going to use the weight for now. And so we're going to carefully place it in there. And as you can see, I have allowed just enough room to where the brine is not going to spill over the jar. And so after you add the weight with a nice, clean, sanitized lid, which you can also buy off of Amazon, you just search for fermentation kits or fermentation lids, and you'll either see this style or you're going to see more of what I call the bubbler style. And what I would do with this one is I'd fill about 1/3 of the way up with either water or salty brine again, and then I would just simply screw on the lid. Okay, and so once you do that, because this is preventing air from actually entering, it'll start to bubble in a couple of days when the bacteria start to go through that fermentation process. Okay, so that is one lid type you can use. The other lid type can be a little bit messier because what you're going to have to do is a process called burping the jar, which sounds weird, but when you put on this style lid, what's going to happen is the fermentation process is going to allow that brine to continue to rise. And so this is going to puff up, and to burp the jar, you basically just have to pinch in the middle and water's going to squirt out. And so make sure you have some space with a towel when you're doing this, because I'm going to be completely honest, it's not going to smell very good. It's not rotting, but because bacteria is causing this fermentation process, it's not going to be the best smelling thing. And so I usually keep this down in the basement where we can't really smell it when it's going through the fermentation process.
Which lid do you like?
I actually prefer the bubbler lid because you get to actually see the bubbling occur, which tells you fermentation is actually happening. And so I like to use this one, but these work just as well because it is still cutting off oxygen from getting into the jar. And so that's very important. We cannot let oxygen get in here because that's how mold is going to form. Okay, and so I'm going to let this sit for about 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, you successfully should have sauerkraut.
Nice. What do you eat with sauerkraut?
And so after 2 weeks, this is kind of what it's going to look like. What I've actually done to keep it longer is I took a different lid and I gave this what I call a hot water bath. So I had boiling water, I dropped it in there for about 10 minutes, took it out, and this sealed. So that means once it's sealed, oxygen is not getting in there anymore. Now, when you're ready to eat, this is another trick from my grandma. You want to get rid of about the first inch on the top, eat the middle portion, and then get rid of about half an inch of the bottom. So you don't want to eat the top, you don't want to eat the very bottom, eat the middle portions. What you can eat this with, very popular, served with bratwurst. I guess you can serve it with hamburgers, but mainly German style foods is what this is really good with. And I would recommend heating it up before you eat it. Sauerkraut.
Nice.
I also wanted to show you this jar just so you can see that there is still brine in there. But again, this top portion, we don't really want to eat just in case. There shouldn't be anything wrong with it because it is sealed. But once I pop that open, I'm going to go ahead and throw away about the first inch again. I'll eat that nice middle portion right here. And then, like my grandmother said, just go ahead and throw away the last half or the last bottom portion just because.
What do you think about cabbage, Dixie?
And you can see this is kind of the reason why, because stuff kind of settles down. It's going to be a lot saltier probably at the bottom. So she just told me throw out the last little portion.